Hi, Joseph. How are you doing?
Good to see you again. I remember we did an interview before. It's good to do it again.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
That,
Samaya told me it was back in 98 or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's when I got this from you.
Wow. Great. That's a long time
Yeah,
ago. Yeah.
yeah, it was. How have you
Yeah.
how have you been?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I had 4 books came out last year. From October through March, I had 4 books published, including a big critical study of Billy Wilder and a book called Political Truth, uh, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. That was another big book. And I have one of the Coen brothers. And so I've been very busy.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak to me.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm trying to
No
turn off
problem.
this phone. Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it. That's great. Let me just change my background. I have a picture of myself. Let's see. I have a picture of myself outside Spielberg's home in Phoenix. There we are.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that's when I was researching the book. There I am. See, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
this is way
So
back in the 90s, right? Like your first edition came out in the late 90s. Am I correct?
yeah, 97. So this would have been around 94 or 95, something like that, when I was researching the book.
Great. So I'm just gonna go through very random questions, and I might just have follow-up stuff. Tell me your background, how you became an author, and also my guess is that you're primarily focused on entertainment and biographies. I'm sure there's other stuff that you do too, but
Yeah.
talk me through that.
Well, I teach at San Francisco State University. I'm a cinema professor,
Hmm.
and I've been writing books since 1963. When I was a kid, I wrote a book on baseball slang, called High and Inside, and that started me off. And then I wrote 3 books on Orson Welles. The first one I wrote when I was in college, and then I did one on John Ford, a critical study, and then I went to Hollywood and I worked for Variety as a reviewer and reporter for quite a while. And I was a newspaper man in Wisconsin and California before going to Variety. And then I started freelancing as a book writer, and moved to Northern California in the year 2000, and got the teaching job. But I've been writing books all the way through. So I've done 24 books.
Wow,
Yeah, and
that's amazing.
yeah, thank you. So I'm currently yeah, I'm working on a couple of book projects. School is about to start, so I'm focusing on that too.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but I did the Spielberg book. I mainly do these books to rectify some kind of injustice. If I feel that somebody's been neglected or maltreated by the public or the media, like certain artists are misunderstood, like Spielberg is misunderstood. I felt that there weren't any serious when I wrote my book, there was no really good biography or critical
No,
study of him.
no, there wasn't any at all.
No.
At all. And I think following your book, a lot of books came out, like small, medium, but I mean, yours was the main one. And I remember I was at the time when I was starting my site. I don't know if you remember this, but I was starting my website on Steven Spielberg, and then it kind of turned into a DreamWorks fan site. I
Mm.
remember the first thing that I kind of got understood about Spielberg in terms of his childhood
Uh-huh.
came from your book, and these pictures, especially.
Oh, wow.
Right? These pictures that you have in the book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
And then
I got some rare pictures. Yeah.
and this was my first introduction to the film that was later translated into Close Encounters of the Third Kind,
Yeah.
Firelight. But no, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would like to know more about um, you as a professor, because I'm in film now too. Like that's my full time. I'm a filmmaker. I
Uh,
direct human rights based documentaries.
uh,
And I was actually in Wisconsin just a few days ago at University of Madison. We were doing a screening
Good.
of one of my films.
Oh,
Um,
got the
yeah.
Cinematech there, huh? You know,
No, this was they have so my film is about it's called In Search of My Sister.
mhm,
It's about a Uyghur American activist whose sister is taken by the Chinese Communist Party due to her activism in states. So
hmm,
there's a department there called Asian Studies or Your Asian Studies,
hmm.
and they contacted us for a screening event. So, anyways, going off topic here, what sort of inspired you to be into like writing specifically about films? I know you like to write about artists that have not been done justice, but that
Yeah,
connection with, and you're teaching as a professor now, so you're connected with cinema a lot. Like, what is
yeah.
that ingredient that's always stirring?
Well, I was a film fan when I was a kid, but I was going to be a politician or a lawyer or politician, and I worked for John F. Kennedy in 1960
Oh,
on
you
his
did?
presidential primary campaign. I'll just show you a picture here. Um, I took this photograph of him in the background. It's
Yeah,
a
I
big
see it.
close,
I see it.
and
Yeah.
here's another one I took. Yeah, I took this one too. I was a volunteer on his campaign, and but I was very disillusioned when he was killed, and they didn't really bother solving the crime. And so I got into movies instead. I was in Madison. I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I saw
Oh, good.
Citizen Kane in a film class in 1966, and that changed my life. I then thought I will write films, write and direct films, and write about films. So I started writing a book on Wells. Right now, they're having a 24-hour marathon of Wells films on Turner Classic Movies right in the background
Nice.
here. So I spent 4 years writing a book on Wells, and then I got into The Other Side of the Wind. You've seen that film?
Which
Has
one, sorry?
The Other Side of the Wind?
Long time ago. Long time ago.
Well, it came out in 2018.
Oh, then
It's
I'm thinking mixing it with Gone with the Wind. Sorry about that. My
no, no.
apologies.
Well, Wells in 1970 started making a film about filmmaking, starring John Huston as an old director trying to make his comeback in the new Hollywood. And he put me in the film. It was my first visit to Hollywood, and I met him, and he said, "Would you like to be in this film we're making?" And Peter Bogdanovich was rounding up young film buff characters, for the film, and they put me in it as a young film critic historian who's interviewing John Huston all through the film and
Yeah.
pestering him. And so this film, I spent 5 years working for Wells as an actor, which was a really great experience. And but the film didn't come out until 2018. It's on Netflix,
The
constantly
other
playing.
side of the wind.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning if you want to. And so that was a great film experience. But I wrote screenplays for about 10 years, and the one film that I did that got a lot of attention was Rock and Roll High School with the Ramones. Good film, punk rock
Yeah.
musical. Yeah. I
Okay.
also did a Canadian film called Blood and Guts, a wrestling film called Blood and Guts.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it. I've
It's
heard
made
of it.
around Toronto. But I didn't
Right.
like being a screenwriter because, you're treated badly in Hollywood. Uh, but
How
I wrote,
so?
yeah, I wrote 5 AFI Life Achievement Award programs. Those were the best experiences I had.
Sure.
James Stewart, John Huston, Lillian Gish, Frank Capra, and Fred Astaire. And I got to work with a lot of great people. And but then I went full time writing books in '84 on Frank Capra. That took 7 years. And had a lot of problems, legal problems, getting the book out. So I wrote a book recently called "Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra," which is about how I overcame the legal battle to get the book out. So, but it was really, I got to be a big film buff in the late 60s. And that's when film magazines and film books started coming out a lot. And, the film studies was just starting up, and I was in the early part of that. And, but Spielberg and I are about the same age, and I've always loved his films. And I thought of writing a biography of him around the time of E.T., but I thought he was too young.
Mhm.
And I liked his films from way back. I saw Something Evil in 1972, I guess it was,
No,
on
70, 71, 72 Duel came out, I think.
Yeah, you're
Uh,
right. Yeah,
yeah,
so my first exposure to him was I flipped on TV, and I heard he was this young director, very young guy, very unusual. And I thought this was a very inventive film, and I thought I would look him up in Hollywood. When I went to Hollywood in 1971 again to work on the Wells film, I was going to call Spielberg and ask for an interview, and I just didn't have time, unfortunately.
right.
Uh, but so I wait after a while. I thought, well, there really should be a good book on him, and uh, uh, what's his name? Nigel Morris, wrote that good book on Spielberg, and he calls me the godfather of Spielberg studies, which is very nice. That's a very good critical study. And Lester Friedman just came out with a new edition of his Citizen Spielberg, which is a really good book, and he's updated that.
Oh, I have to
Maybe you
take a
should
look at
have
that.
him on your show. He'd be a good guest, Lester.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And um, did you for your book? Did you ever interview Spielberg? I'm sure. I'm imagining you.
No,
No.
well, I don't do authorized biographies because
Ah,
you don't have freedom unless you do them
yes, that's
unauthorized.
true.
So what I did was I interviewed 100 people before I approached Spielberg, and I wanted to make it a fait accompli. And I wrote to Marvin Levy, his PR
Yep.
guy,
Yeah.
who's a very nice man. And I said I'd like to do an interview with him, but I'm doing an unauthorized biography. And he called back and said, Stephen knows your work and he respects you, but he doesn't give interviews uh, for books. He controls the books that are published about him, basically. And
Yeah.
it was really because it's an unauthorized biography. There was an authorized sort of biography that somebody did with his help, and then he puts out these books on the making of films and stuff like that. And so I never got to interview him. But Marvin said he will not do anything to hamper your book. The only thing he did was he told his mother not to talk to me. Uh, we could, you, could, you, you could ask me this on the show if you want to. It's funny because
Yeah, please go ahead.
your mother knows all the really bad stories
Yeah.
about you. What you have under your bed and stuff. But I interviewed his father, which was more important to me because his father had never been interviewed before, and he was a fascinating man. And I got a really good interview with him before Stephen didn't even know I was going to talk to his father. And then he told his father not to talk to me anymore. But other than that, if people called Spielberg's office, they were told that I was kosher, which I thought was very nice. So he kind of helped. Actually, he was one of the more helpful biographical subjects I've had because he didn't stand in the way, and he said I was kosher, and so people talked to me. And not everybody would talk to me, but
Yeah.
I talked to over 300 people.
I think as an artist, he probably understands that, but at the same time, as an individual, he also wants to make sure that, I mean, like anybody else, right? Like we would want to be like, okay, you shouldn't speak to that person if they're going to ask me
Yeah,
questions.
yeah,
And I mean, he's a different type of a director and a filmmaker than, let's say, like for example, Elton John had I think it was a movie that was made on him, Rocket Man, that just
yeah,
recently came out, and he said in an interview that my whole thing was that you can ask me whatever you want and I'll put it out there. And I think it's more about a personality thing, right? Elton John is more of an
yeah,
extrovert and Spielberg is more of
yeah.
an introvert.
Well, and
But
Spielberg is a control freak, and I'm a control freak. In other words,
exactly.
we both like to really control our work, and it's two
Yeah,
control freaks colliding. But I'm
absolutely.
told by a director friend of mine who worked for Spielberg that he likes my book very much, which I thought was nice. It's actually the only biography of him aside from the children. There are many children's biographies that are kind of shallow, but mine is the only regular biography that is sympathetic. Other ones are negative; they attack him.
Yeah.
Except for Tony Crowley did a little biography way back in the 70s, I believe, or 80s, and it was a short book, but it was pretty good. It just didn't have a lot of interviews, a lot of research that I
Sure.
want to. I had to kind of invent the whole field of Spielberg studies because nobody had done the research before, you know. So the great thing was I spent a lot of time on his childhood because it's so formative, and I interviewed all these kids who worked with him on his amateur films, which was a wonderful story that nobody
Oh,
had
you
ever done.
did.
Yeah, so I
That's
mean, I
cool.
covered the same ground that Fabelmans is covering, you know, and
Nice.
it was great because they all told me, you know, we've been waiting 30 years for somebody to ring the doorbell and ask us to talk about Stephen, and they all had great stories. You know, it's a wonderful story of a kid teaching himself to be a filmmaker. You know.
Yeah. And that's you mentioned about like negative portrayal of Spielberg, or let's say others. And I find that sometimes, like I read this book, The Dream Team, which was about DreamWorks, and I actually spoke to the gentleman too. And it was it's one thing to talk about how things happen to people and why things are not successful, by empathizing with the character or protagonist. But
Mhm.
then another thing, just to completely write out attack, like which a lot of media journalists do as well, not just in entertainment, in every sector. So it's good. I think with your book, I remember like my world. I knew about Spielberg films, like from 1993 to 1997, but I didn't know about his life
Mm,
at all until I
mm.
read your book when it came
Oh,
out. Yeah,
okay.
so which was certainly an eye opener, and I haven't honestly. I think you have had a couple of updated editions, right? That came out in
Yes,
2012.
the last one was the third edition in 2012.
Yeah,
It's I
and
brought it up to the point of him doing Lincoln, right up to Lincoln, you know.
yeah. Speaking of, you mentioned Fablemans, which I know you have seen. We're at the test screening.
Oh, no, I
Um,
wasn't there, but I
oh,
have
you went.
a source who reported to me on the test screening. I could talk about
Okay,
that.
sorry. Maybe I misunderstood.
Are we rolling yet, or are we just chatting?
No, we're recording. I'll take this part out. Don't worry.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah, I'll take that
yeah,
part out.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, Fablemans. From what you have been told by your source who saw the test screening that happened, I think in New York last week, it was, or two
New
weeks ago?
Jersey,
New
back
Jersey,
toward the end of July.
right? From what you heard, does it cover? Like I know Spielberg has said that it's loosely based on his childhood.
Yeah, it's kind
But
of semi-fictional, but it's semi-autobiographical is the best way to put it. And I was thinking it reminds me of the 400 Blows, the Truffaut film, because Truffaut changed the name of his character and changed the time period and changed some of the circumstances, but it's really autobiographical. And Truffaut was Spielberg's favorite director when he was young, and then he worked with him in Close Encounters, so they have an affinity.
yep, yep,
Um, but The Fablemans is about it starts in New Jersey where Spielberg lived. He was born in Cincinnati, but it begins in New Jersey when he was a small boy. And it begins with him being taken to see The Greatest Show on Earth, the Cecil B. DeMille film,
right.
which
Which
he says
inspired him.
was the first movie he ever saw. Uh, he actually saw that in Philadelphia. I'm not sure if they made it that scene in Philadelphia or New Jersey, but they lived right across the river. And my source tells me that's how it starts. And he said he was confused by it because his father said we're going to see a circus movie, and he thought they were going to see lions and acrobats and
Zebras
stuff.
and all
And
that. Yeah.
yeah, and instead there was this curtain that opened and it was a flat screen. He was initially disappointed, but then he got into the movie and he got very excited, and he was very excited by the terrific train crash sequence.
I was gonna bring that up, that how he, the cutting of it and made him realize that how you can build suspense.
Yeah, so he went out and he started crashing his toy trains, and then his
Yeah.
father said, this is a well-known story, that his father said, Stephen, if you keep doing that, I'll take away your toy trains. So Stephen had the bright idea of filming it, because one thing I
Yeah.
discovered that nobody knew, his father, Arnold, was an amateur filmmaker from way back.
He had 8 millimeters camera, I think.
Yeah, he was taking
Yeah.
home movies and stuff, and he apparently wasn't particularly good at it, but he was into it. Arnold was a very technical guy. He was one of the inventors of computers. He had patents for computers. He was a pioneer. He worked for RCA and other companies, and just a wonderful man. Died just a few years ago, well
Yeah,
over 100.
100
And
years.
yeah, so he did all kinds of fascinating technical things. So among them were movies, and the kids who made Steven's early films with him told me they, it was his father's son hobby too. This is another big revelation in my book, because when I did my book, Steven had been saying for years that he and his father didn't get along. Well, I found out that they were very close in his youth, and Steven worked with his father on the early films. And one of the kids said, I didn't know who was really directing the film, whether it was Steven or Arnold, the father, you know. And he worked with them all the way through on Firelight, his first feature film he made when he
Mm,
was 16.
yeah.
And then they even formed a little company called Playmount Productions when Steven, and another discovery I made, for example, nobody had ever gotten the divorce records. The divorce of his parents was such an important part of his story. It's been
Of course.
reenacted many times in his films, and in the
Yeah.
Fabelmans, that's a big part of the story, is the parents are getting divorced, and the mother is having an affair with a family friend, which really happened. And I had that story in my book. I got the story. Bernie Adler was a good friend of theirs, and she had a romance with him. And Arnold was kind of a self-confessed workaholic, and he was, not around a lot. So Leah, Stephen's mother, had this romance, and I found out at the time Stephen blamed his mother. He didn't quite know what was happening.
Yeah.
And then later he became estranged from his father. But in the divorce papers, it said Arnold got the custody of Stephen, which was interesting. And they moved to LA together. And Stephen went to college at Cal State Long Beach because he was rejected by USC and UCLA,
Yeah.
which shows you how colleges should be more open to creative young people.
Right.
But anyway, Stephen was living with his dad, and then they started having some friction over various things, and that's when the trouble began. But they had a little company together to make some films, and so Arnold was supportive of Stephen's hobby, and he worked on Firelight, etc., and he worked on all the little films Stephen made before that, and I chronicled all that in my book, and I interviewed dozens of people who were kids working on those films. It was just really wonderful to see the evolution of an artist at a time when there weren't too many um, young people getting into films, because when I used to read Variety when I was young,
Mhm.
and I would find out in Variety there was this 21 or 22-year-old kid making films in Hollywood, TV films, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. I should interview this guy. And when I went to Hollywood in '71 to be doing more shooting on the Wells film, I thought I'll look up Steven Spielberg, and I could have called him and gone and interviewed him, and I wish I had, but I was just too busy. Um, but I was aware of him, and then I saw Something Evil on TV, and the opening is very spectacular, and I
Yeah.
thought, wow, this guy really knows how to make a film. So he was on my radar. But anyway, so I had a great time tracing, in great depth his youth and his path to
Sure.
becoming a filmmaker. I spent a lot of time in his TV work too, which is very interesting. Hadn't been covered much. I interviewed people who worked with him on television,
He worked
and
on I think he directed an episode of Columbo, right? And was it who was the actress that gave him a hard time, the older actress? Uh Crawford something?
oh no, Joan Crawford. The first TV show he did was with Joan Crawford. It's called Eyes.
Eyes.
It was a production of Night Gallery, which Rod
Yes,
Serling had this show after the Twilight Zone. Actually,
right.
she treated him very well. She was kind of shocked at first to be given this 21, 20, I guess he was 22 when he made that film. Um, but she went along with him, and she realized he was talented, and to her credit, she treated him well. But
Okay.
the crew guys didn't treat him well. Back in those days, all the crew guys were these old men who had been around for a long time, and they were very
Long time.
conservative and hidebound, and they were giving him a difficult time, and it was tough. And he
So
had to work under really tight schedules, etc. But he had
it's
the, sorry,
sorry, go on. No, please go on.
well, he had this powerful patron, Sid Sheinberg, who was
Yeah,
head of TV at the time. Then he became head of motion pictures. But Steven's mentor, and how he got into films is another story that had not been told correctly. He claimed, and people still believe this story, that he got off a tour bus, and wandered around, and then the next day he showed up with a briefcase and a suit,
yeah.
and opened a empty office. And that's just, I interviewed a woman who worked with him there, and she said that's horseshit. Uh, what he actually did was he had a family connection. This is what he was covering up. His father knew a guy at Universal who was in charge of computers, and his father called this guy and said, "Could you help my son?" And he said, "Well, the guy he should talk to is Chuck Silvers, who's the head librarian of Universal, film librarian.
Right.
And he's a very nice man, wonderful man." And I interviewed him, and Steven met him and showed him some of his amateur films. And Chuck was immediately impressed. He recognized he was in the presence of a really talented guy. He said it was like meeting the young Leonardo da Vinci, which I thought was
Eventually, yeah.
amazing. And Steven was making Firelight, and he told him about it. And so he gave Steven a job in summer of '64 when he was still in high school. For the summer, he was an intern, just an unpaid intern in Chuck's office. He was running errands, basically. He would carry, invoices around to Technicolor building and different offices and things like that. But it gave him the free run of the studio, so he didn't crash the studio gates. I knew that was a false story because I used to go to Universal when I was a reporter, and you couldn't get on the lot without a pass. They had security guards. It was,
I'm so glad you mentioned that because um that is something that has been on the internet since the internet's been around, right? Like the
mm,
90s. And I heard that story several times, and I ended up not digging into it deeper. I thought that was it. And I used to wonder, like, was it that easy to walk over to a
no,
studio and like
I knew it wasn't. It was tough, and especially Universal was a very controlled studio. They called it the Black Tower, that imposing building. It was kind of like a
yeah.
very regimented place. But so Stephen was roaming the streets of Universal, and he would go on sets, and he'd watch people shoot films. And on one set, he encountered John Cassavetes, who was acting in a TV show, and Cassavetes took a shine to him, and he said, "Tell me some directions, and I'll do them." And so he let Spielberg kind of direct him in the show, and they became friends. And Stephen worked on Faces as a production assistant, for
Yeah.
example. And then he got thrown off a Hitchcock set of Torn Curtain. Hitchcock didn't want him looking at the set. Later, when Hitchcock made his last film, Family Plot, Stephen wanted to go on the set of that, and Hitchcock said no. Now, I wangled my way onto the set of Family Plot for 3 days, but Spielberg wasn't allowed. But Hitchcock would sit there. Jaws had just come out, and he would sit in his chair, and every day at noon, somebody would bring him the reports on how Jaws was doing at the box office. And he was really excited because he and his wife were the third biggest stockholders in Universal. But poor Stephen was not allowed to watch him. But Stephen also did things like he would see people in the streets. He would see Cary Grant. He'd walk up and say, "Hi, can we have lunch?" And Cary Grant said, "Sure," And he was a likable young fellow, and people took a shine to him. And Charlton Heston took him to lunch. Rock Hudson. Um, he thought Heston was kind of condescending and arrogant, and so years later, Heston wanted to play the lead role in Jaws, and Stephen had the pleasure of saying no to him. He kind of got back at him for being kind of haughty. But anyway, so the way Stephen got into films was not the way he portrays. And but the story, directors all have what I call the creation myth of how they get started, and it's usually fabricated. And in my biographies, I dispel the myths, like Frank Capra's story of how he got into films was just totally wrong. And it's usually to make themselves seem like budding geniuses even more than they were. And he was a budding genius, but he enhanced it. So anyway, I did a tremendous amount of research, and then I did a lot of research on the films like Jaws, for example. I had a really in-depth series of interviews with all kinds of people who worked on the film, and I got beyond the accepted versions of what happened on that film, and I really go into depth on how that got made. The problem I had on that book, when you're doing a living subject, people are more cautious, and even though Spielberg's office said people could talk to me, a lot of actors especially didn't respond to my requests, like Richard
Yeah.
Dreyfuss, for example, and Liam Neeson, and you know, so I couldn't get to some of the people. I think they're afraid. Actors as a group tend to be more timid because they're worried about jobs, and they're worried about working with the guy if they say something he doesn't like. But the farther back in time it went, people who worked on TV shows and early films with Steven were more than happy to talk because they wanted to tell the world how they contributed to his work. You know, people who worked on Duel
Yeah.
and things like that. You know?
I think that's also true for any profession, because, and maybe, you know, for yourself and for me too, is like when, if it's something in the recent past, you don't want to talk about it, you know, publicly or privately, but when it goes history, like, you know, we always look at our childhood, oh, you know, when I was a kid, I used to do this and that, and I used to do that, but we would never say, oh, you know, last year I did this, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. The more recent it is, the more touchy it is.
It is.
But with
Yeah.
Capra, I interviewed 175 people, you know, all the way back to people who knew him when he was a boy in Los Angeles. And most of them had never been interviewed before too. And one thing I did in my biographies that had not been done in film biographies before that, I interviewed so-called ordinary people, not just stars, because film biographies before that time, they'd interview like 10 or 15 movie stars and directors or whatever, and that was it. But I interviewed, I was inspired by Robert Caro, who wrote the biographies of Lyndon Johnson. He's on the
Mhm.
final volume now. And he interviewed all kinds of regular people in Texas who were affected by Johnson, for example. And it really gives a sense of, you know, who this guy was and what milieu he came out of. And so with the
Sure.
living subject, I was able to interview school teachers, his Cub Scout and Boy Scout leaders, and his babysitters and his neighbors, you know, adults who knew him as well as the kids. And it was a goldmine of stuff that had never been tapped. But I had a great time interviewing all those folks, and very few of them said no. And so I really presented this portrait. I'm fascinated by how artists begin and how they evolve, and this was a great evolution of a child.
It's an arc, right? It's
Yeah.
certainly an arc. And I find it interesting you talked about Alfred Hitchcock, and to me it resonated with the story of Jaws. You said that how Spielberg wanted to be on the set of Hitchcock's film, but he never allowed Spielberg to be. And the same thing in Jaws, the shark Bruce, which was never working, but it kind of played in its favor, the film's favor. So I wonder, again, this is just a speculation. I wonder if Spielberg had been on the set of Hitchcock movie, would he be the filmmaker that he is today? Not that he won't be as good, but it's just that enticement of not, you know, that ability of, not ability, that element of not knowing what your hero is, how he works on the set. Maybe that made him, you know, that's, again, this is just my theory. I'm not an expert
Well,
by any.
he did see a little bit of Torn Curtain, so but he was in the background, you know. And when I was on the set of Family Plot, I got very close to the shooting. Like I was in the garage set when they had kidnapped a bishop, and he was in the trunk of this car, and they were putting a needle into him. And I was standing right next to Hitchcock and the cinematographer, and Hitchcock got all excited and started making up shots. He made up 7 shots in a row, and I'm writing all this down. And I found the notes yesterday. I was going through my storage, and this influenced a book called Hitchcock at Work by Bill Crone. And he found out that Hitchcock improvised a lot more than he let on, because people think he storyboarded everything, and Bill found out that's not true. He tended to storyboard action sequences and special effects sequences, but not the dialogue sequences. And like any director, he would set up the scene and have the actors move around and then start staging it. And one of the best pieces of advice I heard, I interviewed Joan Darling, who's a wonderful actress who was in the Psychiatrist episode, one of two that Steven directed, and she was brilliant in it. And she became a director, and she said to me that when she directed Amazing Stories, she did a really good episode for that. She asked Steven for advice on directing, and he said, well, get a pair of comfortable shoes. And she said, okay. And then he said, sit down a lot, conserve your energy. And she said, okay. And then she said, literally, she said, Steven, 30 years from now, some scholar is going to come around and ask me what you told me. Is that all you're going to say? And he said, well, what do you want to know? And she said, how do you decide where to put the camera? Great question. And he said, okay, watch where you're standing when you watch the rehearsal, and that's where you should put the camera.
Ah,
I quote that to students a lot. That's a great piece of advice.
that's great advice.
Yeah, so that's what a director does. Hitchcock, I saw him do that, and Spielberg does that, and that allows the actors some freedom, within your visual concept.
Yeah.
You discover things with them, and then you stage it accordingly. And Spielberg has a tendency, I noticed, and he talks about it now, of doing 3 or 4 shots in one. He likes to do long takes, not terribly long like some directors do, but fairly involved takes where there'll be a medium shot, it'll move into a close-up, then pan over and move in,
Yeah.
pull back, and instead of just cut, he does that. And he's very big with film geography. You always know where you are in a Spielberg film, which is not true most films today.
Well, the way his films are, I was talking about this to the director of The House of Sand and Fog, which is like a DreamWorks film, Vadim Perlman. And with Spielberg, the way there are other filmmakers like that too, but I know Spielberg more than I know any other filmmaker, is you cannot, even though his the way his acting, his characters put the performance on, the cinematographer moves the camera, when you're watching the film, you're so much into it that no matter how hard you try to appreciate a great shot, it's like invisible camera, right? Like you just don't see, you can't, not that you don't appreciate the shot because it's not good, but because you're just so into it. And I think one of the longest takes he's done, to my knowledge, which was not the intention at the production time, you've seen the movie The Post, right? With Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep. So the opening was quite long, them sitting in the restaurant, and he had done like coverage, all of that during the production. And I think it was a great decision. Obviously, I mean, he made that, it really pulled you in to those two characters' chemistry and their arc right in the beginning, because they go back and forth throughout the film, their form of decision making, whether one is right or the wrong. And that was, and I honestly didn't even pay attention that until I read it, that it was like a one take shot. So that's what's so genius about that, right? And so you're not just doing it as a gimmick.
Yeah, no, I love directors who do that. George Cukor is another one. He has shots that go on for several minutes. Hitchcock famously did Rope in a series of long takes. Orson Welles has done some of the greatest long takes in film history. Max Ophuls, Scorsese, yeah. But Spielberg likes to, you're right, it immerses you into the scene. And, he is a somewhat flamboyant director, but you do kind of forget the camera when you're, I mean, he's very complex with his mise en scène, and most viewers are not conscious of that. But I'll tell you a funny story. I found this out from one of the TV people, that on his Columbo show, one of the actors, and I won't identify who it is because
that's fine,
it's embarrassing. Steven had set up a very long take for the first thing in the morning. They were going to shoot a scene in a kitchen, and it was going to be this long, complicated take. And the actor arrived drunk. I'll just say it wasn't Jack Cassidy. People assume it was, but he was perfectly okay during the shooting. But this actor arrived drunk and was stumbling into the furniture and stuff. And Steven called the producers and said, "What am I going to do?" And they said, "Well, he wanted to recast the part, run out in the streets at Universal and find another actor, but it's not that easy." So they said, "You got to do what you got to do." So he restaged the scene with a whole lot of cuts to make it possible for the actor to do the scene in short takes. But he was disappointed. But even then, and I saw Marcus Welby TV show he did with a very long shot moving around with a moving camera and stuff. And TV shows back then were pretty formulaic, and he would break the formula, and that's why he had some problems with some of the older guys at the studio. But Sid Sheinberg, being his mentor, really believed in Steven. And the way he got to be Sheinberg's protege was Chuck Silvers kept telling him, "Steven, the 8mm and 16mm films you're making, nobody will watch them except me." In Hollywood, they're very biased against that kind of film because they think it's amateur time. So he said, "They're not going to watch the film until you make 35mm professional looking film." And so he found a guy named Dennis Hoffman, who was a friend of Julie Raymond, was Sid Sheinberg's assistant. And Steven was sitting, he didn't have an office, she told me. He was sitting in a chair next to her desk. That was his office. And she would hand him these invoices and he'd go running for them. And she's the one who said the story about him having his own office was horseshit. But anyway, she knew this guy, Dennis Hoffman, who was, he managed a rock group called October Country, and he had a little money and he had a little studio where he rented the studio out for commercials, but he wanted to be a producer. And so Steven went to him and Dennis said, "Well, I'll make a short film for you as long as it doesn't have dialogue, because it's too expensive to do that, and you can use my rock group for the soundtrack." So he wrote Amblin, which is a beautiful film.
I love it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. He doesn't let people see it, unfortunately.
It's on YouTube.
Yeah, it pops up on YouTube in a very bad print. I have a pretty good copy of it myself, but it's a lovely film. It's very poetic, and it's kind of like a Truffaut film, and it's bittersweet and says a lot about the period. He thinks it's a cliched film about the period, but I think actually it conveys a lot about that period of the hippie movement. The young guys, kind of fake hippie, conning this young girl. And anyways, so what happened was Silvers saw this film and he was knocked out by it, and he showed it to all the other editors at Universal, and they all were weeping. He said all these old guys were crying, and one guy said it's the perfect motion picture. So Sheinberg, Silvers thought, how can I help this kid? And he said, I think he should go into TV because he can get a lot of work. He couldn't just jump in and do a feature, but he told Sheinberg's projectionist to put on Amblin at the end of the rushes every night. He watched the rushes at 9 o'clock, and he put on Amblin, which is 26 minutes long. And the next morning, Chuck Silvers came to his office. He had 8 phone messages from Sid Sheinberg. Who is Steven Spielberg? Where is Steven Spielberg? Get me Steven Spielberg, all that kind of stuff. So Silvers called him, and Steven was staying with some relatives in LA, and he said, put on a suit and tie, or a sport coat and tie, and get over here for a meeting with Sheinberg today, and call him sir, because he calls everybody sir, and be very polite. And so he went in to see Sheinberg, and Sheinberg told him how impressed he was by the film. He later said he was impressed not only by this young director, but also by his choice of actors. That was a good comment, because Spielberg's most underrated talent is he's a really terrific director of actors. I interviewed a guy named Anson Williams, who was a young actor on one of the TV shows and later became a director. And he said, any director can get a great performance out of Al Pacino, but only Steven Spielberg could get a great performance out of a rubber puppet, which I thought was a great comment.
Well, you look at his films, right? Like E.T., you look at the Empire of the Sun, Christian Bale. Now he's back to nobody. You look at so many of his films, even Ray Fiennes and Schindler's List. I don't think he was Ray Fiennes at the time. Like, he probably had done some stuff like theater stuff. But to me personally, it's not just even actors, it's also directors. His biggest discovery was Sam Mendes, who directed American Beauty. and he actually, if this story is correct, I mean, from what I remember that I read, he watches a lot of theater in the UK. So
Yeah.
he saw a play that Sam had directed, and American Beauty was in his possession, and he went to him and said, "Here you go." And that the way Sam Mendes made that film, not a single scene shot was cut. Like, in the test screenings, it was just spot on 100%. So he has that talent of spotting talent,
Yeah, he
which
does.
is
And yeah, Warhorse, he went to see the play, which is very interesting,
yeah,
and very stylized. And he thought this would make a good film, and he made the film. But so anyway, Scheinberg, said, "Sir, would you like to make films?" And Steven said, "Well, I'm a third-year student at Cal State Long Beach, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Sir, do you want to make films or do you want to finish college?" And Steven said, I want to make films, sir, And so he signed him to a 7-year contract, and Steven dropped out of college, which his father was not happy with. But he went back many years later and finished college to kind of give an example to his children,
yeah,
because when he would say to them, "Go to college," they say, "Well, Dad, you didn't finish college." And so he got his degree at Cal State Long Beach, and he turned in Schindler's List as his film project. And he did I guess Jaws was his paper on ichthyology.
that's right. That's
But
right.
he did some papers. He did a paper on the California coastline and things like that. He did some work. But anyway, so Scheinberg then signed him to this contract, and Steven, after a while, resented it because he was kind of frustrated given these assignments. He learned a lot. I've seen almost all the TV work, and he learned a lot from it. For example, he did the first Columbo.
Yeah,
It wasn't the first one to be shot, but it was the first one that aired because they thought it was so good. Levinson and Link, the creators, said it was their favorite of all the Columbos. It's just wonderful. It's about
yeah.
uh,
I've seen it. I have the
yeah,
episode as well.
Murder by the Book. You can get that one
Yeah,
on DVD. I wish
yeah.
there was a box set, by the way, of all Steven's TV work. They should put that out. And there should be. I've also lobbied in my books for Steven to put out his amateur films in a box set on DVD. That would be wonderful, called Steve Spielberg's Home Movies.
Yeah, that would be great. And that's another thing that I hope that he does, which he's never done. He's the only director that doesn't do a commentary track on DVDs.
Right, he
Which is,
doesn't believe in that.
yeah, yeah,
But he does all these elaborate documentaries on each film, which is good. He
yeah, yeah,
documents the
yeah.
shooting, and they do books, making of books. So he controls all that. But it would be, I understand the commentary thing because,
Yeah, so do I. Yeah.
John Ford, who is my favorite director, I interviewed him my first week in Hollywood, and he's almost impossible to interview. I came on the last day of his career. He was realizing his career was over that day because the project just fell through, and he announced his retirement during my interview, and he kind of stonewalled me a lot. He said a few good things, and it was very valuable for me to spend an hour with him as a future biographer, but he never told people what he intended. And I was frustrated by that at the time, but now I really respect that because he wanted the public to make up our own minds about his films.
And I couldn't agree more. I remember when I first learned about the DVD thing, I was in the same position as you were. But about 7-8 years ago, I realized that it's up to the people to figure out and make their own interpretations.
I think that shows respect for the audience, right?
Yeah, yeah. Respect for the audience, and at the same time, you don't want people. You lose that element of you start thinking the film is a film instead of being somewhat of a close to reality thing. Like, it becomes more unreal. I feel.
Yeah.
Go on, sir.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to say one more thing. Steven became very friendly with Stanley Kubrick. I went to Kubrick's memorial service at the Directors Guild, and Steven got up and gave a really interesting talk about his friendship with him, and nobody really knew about it. He had met him a few times in England at his home. He was, a recluse kind of guy. I mean, he worked out of his home. It was kind of an ideal setup. He made his films right around his home area. But Steven was on the phone with him a lot, and also they had a fax hookup. Kate Capshaw finally told Steven, "I will not allow the fax machine in the bedroom," because Kubrick would send faxes at 2 a.m. and stuff.
Yeah.
But Kubrick advised him at one point. He said, "Never tell the press what your intentions are in making a film, because that's all they will say about the film. You know, they won't think for themselves." And Steven has adhered to that. That's kind of like Ford. The only time he made an exception was with Munich, which I think he did because it's a very fraught political issue, you know, the Palestinians and the
Yeah.
Israelis. And he gave an interview to Richard Schickel for Time magazine cover, and he explained his point of view, and very clearly explained his point of view. And still, he got attacked by, you know, people on different sides. But he's one of these guys. He's a wonderful interview subject. He's very introspective and thoughtful, and doesn't just tell the same old stories most of the time. And but he doesn't tell you, here is what I intended, guys. And you know,
Yeah.
I can tell you more about the Fabelmans based on my source. But anyway, we're having a wonderful time navigating
No, no,
different
no, this is
parts.
great.
Parts.
This is fantastic.
Yeah,
This is super, super cool. And I'm glad you mentioned Munich. Munich is an amazing film. Especially for me, when I was watching it, I still remember that scene on the stairway
oh
between
yeah,
the Palestinian and
the
Eric
Israeli
Bana,
Avner.
Eric
Yeah,
Bana, who
yeah,
plays the Mossad agent, and they
yeah,
have this conversation. And the great thing of Tony Kushner, he wrote the script based on the book, but the great thing about that conversation was it wasn't I am right or you're right or I'm wrong. It was just a very organic conversation that two normal people would have, and there was no conclusion in that
yeah,
scene as to who
yeah,
is right. And that to me was Munich, like that, the way they did it. And also at the end, as the story moved forward, it came out 5 years after 9/11. So that's like how many, I don't remember the exact line, but it was like, when we kill some, there are going to be more. We're going to get
right.
inspired. What's the point of doing that? So it
Right.
was it was a great study of human condition that I thought that was amazing, and I don't think it was appreciated. That film was very underappreciated. I genuinely
Yeah,
feel it wasn't, from many sides, and I think when you offend all the sides, then you've done something right.
that's true. I agree with you. Yeah, no, it was a very complex and subtle film, and well written, as you say. And it shows you that both sides have some points in their favor, and it's a very difficult situation that's not easy to solve and may never be solved. And it's a very honest thing. At the end of the
Mm,
film, he shows the World Trade Center buildings with CGI in the background.
yeah,
And um, a lot of his films from 2001 onward were about 9/11, in effect, and what it did to our country. You know, Minority Report, and the film
yeah,
with
that's right.
Tom Hanks, the one where
Terminal.
he's Terminal. You know, is very much about civil liberties. And War of the Worlds is about imagining what it would be
That was
like
a
if our
Yeah,
country was invaded. Like if you're an Iraqi, you know, what's it like to be
yeah.
invaded? You know, and so he was really getting political, and he still is. I just watched Lincoln again last night for pleasure, and it's such a good film about American politics. It's very complex, and also it shows you how an idealistic president, Lincoln, ending slavery, he had to resort to some chicanery and some semi-corrupt methods to get it passed, and persuasion. It really shows you how the political system works, and
Yeah.
demystified Lincoln. A really good film. Tony Kushner again. Kushner wrote The Fabelmans also.
He's been
Um,
working with him since Munich, I think. They
yeah,
both
with a couple of exceptions, but he wrote West
exceptions.
Side Story, etc., which is a good film, I think. But he's a very sophisticated filmmaker. And you know, when I did the book, what the trigger for me finally doing a book was I heard he was going to make Schindler's List, and I thought for years that was kind of a litmus test of his seriousness if he tackled that very difficult subject, because Scheinberg bought the rights to the book in '82 for
82.
Spielberg, and Spielberg kept
Yeah.
hesitating about directing it. He didn't think he was right for it or whatever, or wasn't mature enough. And he tried to get Polanski and Scorsese to make it. But he finally decided to make it, and I thought, okay, let's do this. book, and it fortuitously, took him to a new level of
Oh yeah.
finally getting some critical respect. But people said it was his first serious mature
No.
adult film, but it wasn't. I mean,
Yeah.
Sugarland Express is a serious mature adult film and is a tragic film. But even before that, there was a psychiatrist episode I mentioned with Joan Darling and Clu Gallagher called Par for the Course, in which he Gallagher is a golf professional dying of cancer. It's about a man's death and the effect on his wife. Very powerful film, great performances. And Chuck Silvers, when he saw that, he was very moved. He said, "Stephen, how do you, as this young guy, know about death?" And he said, "Well, when my grandfather was dying for a year, I would go and sit with him next to his bed and observe him. So there's a lot of depth in even the young Spielberg that people didn't recognize. And
Yeah.
Close Encounters is a great film. And I mean, he made films that dealt with children like E.T., but that's also about the divorce of his parents, and it's a painful film. That's why that film was successful. I think I remember Art Murphy, who was our critic at Variety, said at the time that Disney was not doing well at the time because they were stuck in the past. They were making the kind of films that Walt Disney used to make.
Yeah.
And Spielberg made a film about a divorced family, and Disney would not do that at the time. But Spielberg was in touch with the zeitgeist because half of the marriages ended in divorce. So a lot of people, it resonated with people. And Disney was making the kind of films they made in the 50s.
Yeah.
And then Empire of the Sun is a great film. It's been more appreciated lately. It's a magnificent film. As you say,
Color
Christian Bale
Purple.
it's one of the greatest child performances in film
Yeah.
history, and very deep film about war and its effect on children and other people.
Well, I find that with Spielberg, right? That aside from having the knack of finding the talent, he also knows when the time is right to make a certain movie or to release it.
Hmm.
Color Purple is a phenomenal movie, and I remember, it was Out of Africa and Color Purple were the two leading nominations, and Color Purple didn't win a single award.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
then Out of Africa is all about white people.
Um, I saw Out of Africa recently. It was actually a pretty good movie, but at the same time, I mean, you can argue why didn't Color Purple win, but at the same time, you can't argue that why didn't it win a single award. Like, it was just so weird that it was nominated
Yeah.
for so many Oscars and didn't win a single award. Um, and but if you look at his career, you're right. I mean, if you think about it, even Jaws in a way was a serious movie.
Yeah.
The family story, all of them were.
Yeah. No,
Maybe not Raiders.
he's been a serious. Yeah, I mean, he makes Raiders and those kind of
Yeah,
films as escapist films. But there are two sides of him. Like Graham Greene divided his novels in two kinds. There were the really serious novels, and then what he called entertainments. But the entertainments were often as good as the other novels. Um, and so, but Stephen likes to make those kind of fun movies.
yeah,
I'm glad he still does that, because if he was making Schindler's List all the time, it would become oppressive. But he alternates that with some lighter films,
yeah,
and there is that side of him. He's got many sides. One reason he's a producer is he likes to do a lot of kinds of films that he wouldn't necessarily direct, and he
right.
likes to supervise them and have his hand in them. A lot of those films he produces are not very good. There are occasional good ones, but he's a very multitasking person who, he said, he thrives on multitasking. Like, if he had to do one thing for 2 years, he said he would get really tired of it.
Yeah.
But his mind works when he's juggling all these balls, and
Well,
that's the kind of guy he is.
you look at DreamWorks too. I mean, when he came after the success of, I mean, find me one director who has done Jurassic Park and Schindler's List in the
Yeah,
same year.
yeah,
Completely opposite. And then how do you top that, right? And then I think it took like a year after Schindler's List won the Oscar. That's when the idea of DreamWorks started. And then he ran the studio at the same time he was making films like Minority Report, Amistad, AI,
yeah.
Terminal, and which didn't go in the direction that he probably wanted to, but at the same time, I mean, that's a story in itself. he is he's in his mid-70s now, right?
Yeah, he's well, what is he, 75? So he'll be 76 this
Yeah.
December.
So,
I uncovered his true age, by the way, in the book. That was one of my discoveries, because when you're a biographer, you know, you have to find out when the person was born. That's pretty important.
yeah.
And a lot of people in show business cover up their age, but I began hearing, I had a girlfriend who was a journalist, and she told me that Stephen was a year older than he admitted, and she found that in a school record. So I made it a point. I did a very simple thing, journalism 101. I called the Cincinnati Board of Health and asked for his birth certificate. And I sent $8 and I got it back, and it said he was born in December of 1946. He had been saying 47 all those years. In the early days, I found he told the truth. The last time he told the truth about it was to a rabbi who interviewed him. I guess you don't lie to your rabbi, but he was a year older than he claimed, and I found out the reason for it was, I deduced this from my interviews. Dennis Hoffman, the guy who made Amblin, the contract they had was Stephen didn't get paid for it, but for the privilege of directing Amblin, he had to let Dennis produce a film that he would make later on. And Dennis kept after him saying, when are we going to make this film? He could have put Dennis on as a producer of Close Encounters or Jaws or something, but he didn't do it. So Dennis had to run a donut shop in Hollywood instead of being a producer. And Stephen invested in the donut shop, but Dennis's career was blighted by that. And so I came along and I interviewed Dennis, and I decided I would kind of blow my scoop, and I showed him the birth certificate, and he was totally shocked, because he said when he sold Amblin to Spielberg, Spielberg bought it back in the 70s, the film and the name, you know, all the rights to the film. He said he was underage when he signed the contract to make Amblin, but in fact he was 21. They lied to him, and he was 22 the day it came out, but this had been fudged in the media. So I showed Dennis the birth certificate, and he was shocked that Spielberg had misled him, and he was really sad, but he wound up suing Spielberg for $33 million, and it got into the press, and I figured it's worth blowing my scoop to get more information, because I wanted more information. So in the course of the lawsuit, they turned up more and more evidence of, you know, like a birth announcement in a Jewish publication that I hadn't seen. And so Stephen settled the lawsuit out of court with Dennis, and made him a millionaire, reportedly. But it was sad. And a friend of mine who's a psychologist said, I said, why was he sad that he got $1 million? And she said, well, because Stephen was his friend, you know, and his friend let him down. That's a sad story, you know. But so that was part of his mythos. He created that. But just to talk about Color Purple, for example, that had 12 Oscar nominations, but not for director, which was a real snub, And he was cool about it at the time, but on the Oprah Winfrey show later, he admitted that he was very angry and upset that he was snubbed like that. He felt he didn't get respect from the Academy until he got the Oscar for Schindler's List, and it's true. And some of the reviews are really vicious. They compared it to Amos and Andy or Gone with the Wind, or you know, and they said he was stereotyping Black people, which isn't really true. And a lot of the comments were just false. For example, people attacked the film because the characters lived in a nice big house with nice furniture and stuff. And Alan Davio, the cameraman, told me, he said Alice Walker, the novelist, told them, she said, these people, they're middle class people, they shop in Atlanta, they buy the best silverware and plates, you know. And Alan said, we really followed that carefully. And he said, Stephen, I remember his voice rose, he said, Stephen was personally attacked for the way the house looked, because the critics were so racist that they thought all Black people lived in shacks back then. They actually didn't know there was a Black middle class, for example, you know. And that was part of the story, was that the father had risen to middle class status,
Yeah,
and you know, it was about patriarchy to some extent, and it
right.
was a good film, not perfect, but it didn't deserve the attacks. Every time he makes a film about black people, he gets viciously attacked. Amistad, I
Well,
think, is a great film, one of his best films, and
yeah,
he got pilloried for making Amistad. Magnificent film, you know.
I think that would probably still happen today, but from the other way around. Like, it would be more like, well, I spoke to David Franzoni, who
Mm,
wrote Amistad, and he said to me, he told me that Spielberg was very, very particular about making sure that the film doesn't come across as white man saving black man,
right.
right? Digimon Hansu, I forget the character name that he played. He needed to find his own destiny, and he had this whole monologue at the
Yeah.
end of the film. But that is some great valuable information. I wanted to speak to you, just kind of
I just
concluding.
mentioned a couple of things about Amistad before we move
Sure.
off it, because I love that film. Actually, Franzoni's script was rewritten by Steven Zalian, who wrote the great script for Schindler's List. And
Yes.
I've read both scripts, and they had an arbitration, and for some reason, the Writers Guild wouldn't give Zalian credit, and he and Spielberg were upset because, in my opinion, he really deserved credit with
Oh, I
Franzoni
didn't know that.
because he improved the script a lot. But you're right that the black characters have a lot of agency in the film. The Sinkei, the Hansu character,
Okay.
really has a lot of ideas, and part of the fun of the film is he keeps telling John Quincy Adams, the former president of the United States, you should do this, you should do that, and Adams is getting kind of testy about it. But then he realizes that Sinkei is a very intelligent guy, and he should listen to him, and that's part of the theme of the film,
Sure.
is that the black characters are not just passive victims or whatever. And Stephen went to a lot of trouble to get Mende uh, um, dialogue experts to train the actors in how to speak the authentic language, etc. Um, but you know, it was a white-dominated society, and you have to show that the Supreme Court and the Congress were white. But
No, yeah,
it's kind of about black people educating white people about
yeah,
equality, and it's just a profound film, and deeply moving. And to Stephen's credit, he still makes films about subjects like that, knowing he will be attacked. Even and this happened when the film came out. Spike Lee went on Nightline and said a white director like Spielberg shouldn't have made that film. And I really didn't like that, because the corollary would be that Spike Lee shouldn't make films about white people, right?
exactly.
And he did the 25th Hour, which is about white people. It's a good film, and I think anybody should be able to make a film about anything. And Spike Lee had not made the Amistad film. And the thing is, it took somebody with Spielberg's clout to get that film made. So Spike Lee, in a sense, had the point that, well, you know, he couldn't get certain films made. He wanted to make a film on, say, Jackie Robinson, which seems like a no-brainer, but they wouldn't let him do it. But Stephen should be commended for dealing with that kind of subject matter, and he's very interested throughout his career in outsiders. And Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, said that she recognized that E.T. was a being of color, as she put it, and she identified with E.T. She's because, you know, it's about an outsider coming down and making people better,
Yeah,
you know, earth people better. And
right.
that's what happens in Amistad. They come from a ship, just like in ET or Close Encounters. And one reason Close Encounters is so good is that the aliens are not sinister, destructive characters. They're
Mhm.
benign. And it's a vision of brotherhood, you know, between different planets, different species. Where
Right.
in Amistad, they come from a ship, and Amistad translates into friendship. That's the Spanish word for friendship. And that's a pun because it's about friendship, but it's also about a ship of friends coming to help
Yeah.
help white people get educated, you know.
No, I'm glad that you mentioned that part about why should Spielberg direct a movie about black people and vice versa, because that conversation is very relevant today. Where you have like actors who opt out of films because they are going to be portraying like a white actor portraying, let's say, not a white character, but there's makeup and all that, because that's what acting is. Acting is portraying someone that you're not,
Yeah.
and that's not, borderline. That's not prevented by color and whatnot. And honestly, like, I have seen, Ali, which is done by Michael Mann, Spike Lee movies, which are great. The thing with Amistad was, maybe I'm biased being a Spielberg fan, it moved me more than any other movie has about slavery. Um, I don't know what it was. There was just something in there that resonated with me, especially that scene when on the ship, when they're being thrown in the water.
Yeah.
I mean, who has ever shown that before?
Yeah,
Right? They get
that's
that
terribly
was
harrowing. It's like Schindler's List, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and that was not CGI. That was real people being pulled in, and pushed into the water. The actors. Um, yeah, I wanted to speak to you about the Fabelmans. From just kind of closing it up, is that, from what you have heard, is it close to Spielberg? I know we talked about it's kind of like semi-fiction, semi-autobiography, but is it close to Spielberg's childhood? And how many years does it cover in terms of?
Well, from what I'm told, the greatest show on earth begins that's 1952, and it goes to his time when he moves to LA, which is 65 thereabouts. So it's a 14 year period. So it shows him in New Jersey, Arizona, and Northern California. And I kind of deduced from looking at some of the stills that have come out that, for example, it shows his young alter ego, Sammy Fabelman, is the character Gabriel LaBelle, filming a high school graduation party at the beach. And Steven did that, I found out, in Santa Cruz. They have a boardwalk there. It's kind of like Coney Island. And he made a movie called Senior Sneak Day of kids cavorting on the beach. And that's what the guy is making in the film. And in the film, it deals with the divorce of his parents and the mother having an affair with uh, the person they consider kind of like an uncle, but he's really a family friend, and it's played by Seth Rogen.
That's Rogan, yeah.
The mother is Michelle Williams. And Steven's parents, some years after my book came out, they went on 60 Minutes with him, and they talked very frankly about why they got divorced. And Leah mentioned, yeah, I had an affair with our friend Bernie Adler. And Arnold said, I knew about it, but I took the blame because I didn't want the kids to turn against their mother, etc. But one of Steven's best friend at that time told me that Steven was very angry at his mother, and they'd be walking to school and she'd drive by in her Jeep and offer them a ride, and he wouldn't take the ride, etc. So he kind of knew, but he blamed the father later, which was not really fair. So they talked about it. So this film deals with that. And Steven has an uncle in the film played by Judd Hirsch, who apparently gives a wonderful performance, is a very supportive uncle, helps him buy a camera. Steven in this film, he's not making Firelight as I thought he might do. He's making a Western in the film, and he shows it to his Boy Scout troop. And that happened. He made a Western. He made some early Westerns, and he showed one to his Boy Scout troop, and he got a great reaction. I think it's interesting that until recently, Steven said the two kinds of films that he always wanted to direct and never had were a musical and a Western. So he did his big musical finally with West Side Story, but he hasn't made a big theatrical Western, but maybe this is one reason he did that. But then he goes to Northern California, and Saratoga in Northern California was a very white-oriented WASP place. Steven grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Cincinnati, and then as his father advanced in the computer world, they moved into more and more WASPy areas. He had some problems in Arizona, but more problems in Saratoga, which he called Hell on Earth, which is the title of my chapter on that. And he was abused. There was some anti-Semitic bullies who abused him. So that is in the film. He's called names, like they call him Bagelman, for example. They leave a bagel in his locker, and they have other insulting terms. And there's a girl who two girls who try to get Steven to embrace Jesus Christ, for example. You know, one of the ironies of Steven's films is that he's Jewish, but there's a lot of Christian imagery in his films, interestingly enough. I think because he wanted to be accepted by the bigger culture, so he kind of, you know, his films are just full of Christian imagery, like E.T. is a kind of Christ story. But anyway, in this, he starts dating a girl who's a goyim, you know, a Gentile, and one of the great things Steven did as a kid, he had a bully who was abusing him, and he put him in his films playing a Nazi, and he controlled these kids by being a director. The kids told me he was this nerdy guy, and then he got out on the set and he was a totally different person. He's like David Lean, you know, telling them what to do. So he took the bully and made him an actor in his film so he could boss him around. And so that happens in this film. And then, so Steven goes to LA, and then it's apparently some poignant scenes between him and his mother about a conflict they had. But the way the film ends, there were rumors that David Lynch plays John Ford, and that is true. And some people will know the story because Steven has told it on numerous occasions. You could see it in Peter Bogdanovich's film directed by John Ford. It's a documentary that in 1965 or 6, Steven went to John Ford's office, and it shows him in the film going on the set of Hogan's Heroes. And he met the producer, and the guy said, well, the person you should talk to is John Ford. He's in the office over there. So Steven walked in the office, and Ford wasn't there, but his secretary was there. And she said, well, sit here and wait. Mr. Ford will be back from lunch pretty soon. And so the way he told it was Ford came in wearing a sort of safari jacket or a military kind of outfit. And he had kisses all over his cheeks, you know, like kiss marks. And the secretary ran in the office with a box of Kleenex and wiped him off. And then she came out and said, Mr. Ford, we'll give you 1 minute. And this is how the film ends. And Ford sits there and says, so who are you? And Steven said, well, I'm making films, you know, with my friends. I made a lot of films in Arizona and Saratoga, and I'm making a feature film. And Ford was very impatient. So he said, look at those pictures on the wall. He had Western prints on the wall. He said, tell me what you see. And he had the eye patch. This is David Lynch, the director, playing this part. Good casting, I think. And Steven goes over to a Western painting. He says, I see an Indian on a hill on a horse. Ford said, no, 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 where's the horizon? And Steven said, oh yeah, it's in the bottom of the frame, low horizon. Ford said, okay, look at the other picture. And Steven goes to the other picture, and Ford said, what do you see? And he said, oh, okay, I see the horizon is very high in the frame, you know. Ford would do that. And then Ford said, once you learn that it's never good to put the horizon just in the middle of the frame, but always have it low or high, you might learn to be a picture maker. Now get the fuck out of here. And then it cuts to black, and it says directed by Steven Spielberg, and that's the end of that film. So that sounds wonderful. And it's supposed to be, you know, it's the story of a portrait of the artist as a young man, which I relate to because I told that story in my book, and I went into great detail, and all these wonderful, you know, older people who were kids with him told me all these great stories. One of my favorite stories was there was a guy who was a jock at Steven's school, and he said that a bunch of guys said, Steven is shooting at the airport, and they had 2 old World War II planes that were just sitting at the airport as kind of exhibits, you know. And Steven was so charming, he talked the airport into letting him use the planes. And he made a film called Fighter Squad, 8mm film. And he got kids to sit in the cockpit, and he would tilt the camera, make it look like the plane was moving, and he intercut it with 8mm footage that he had bought of actual World War II dogfights. And anyway, this kid said, he got out on the airport, and Steven was directing, and he said, he was like a totally different person. He said, this nerd who you were kicking around at school was giving orders to the bullies and the tough guys. And he said it was like a nerd comes out and plays the piano, and he's Van Cliburn. I thought that was a good analogy. That's how they perceived him. And that was Steven used filmmaking to get social acceptance. It was a big thing for him because he was Jewish, and he said, I was wimpy and Jewish, and those were two negative things in that culture. But he became accepted by being the boss of this group of kids, and he was in the drama club, and he would use girls, for example. He had a lot of girl friends. One of the girls said he had girl friends, by which she meant girls who were friends, not necessarily dating.
Yeah, right.
But also these nice. There were some other kids who were filmmakers. He worked with them. But then there were these bully characters he put in his films. But that's how he got control of his life. And he was a fanatical filmmaker from the age of 10. He's been working as a filmmaker steadily since 1957, which is 65 years now.
Yeah. No, it's I'm gonna sort of really just briefly talk about what you just said about totally different person when he's a filmmaker. And that's what's so great about art, at least even for me, is that it's like Two-Face from Batman, right? It's like you're a completely different person when you're not in the world of films. When you're making films, because you're loving what you're doing, you just become this superhero, if you want to call it, right? And or more like Kent Clark or Bruce Wayne and Batman and Superman. So with that said, Joseph, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. We're probably going to be posting this within the next 2 weeks, maybe next week. We're going to try to figure that out. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciated being on your show. And my Spielberg book, there were 3 editions. The 3rd edition came out from Faber and Faber in England in 2012, but the American edition from University Press in Mississippi came out in 2011. And
Sure. We'll link that up.
I need to, I'm going to do another version after the Fabelmans, because it's a good time to do taking stock. He's 75 years old now, and he's doing his autobiographical film. So I will be doing that. And I have a book on Billy Wilder Dancing on the Edge, which came out in October, critical study. And I have a book called Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. And I updated my Orson Welles critical study / memoir called Whatever Happened to Orson Welles. And then I did a critical study, a short book on the Coen brothers called The Whole Darn Human Comedy, Life According to the Coen brothers. So I've been busy, but I'll get back to Spielberg before too long. I'm excited about the Fabelmans.
Yeah, so am I. Thank you so much again. Appreciate it. You have yourself a great day.
Yeah, it's great talking to you again, Jawad. Thank you very much. See you.
Take care. Bye.
Yeah, take care. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. And do come back for another episode. Until then, have a great day.